election may be over, but some in the media are still furious, perhaps a bit shell-shocked at the outcome. That includes conservative commentators who were in the Never Trump camp and liberal commentators who were in the I can't even imagine this guy as president camp. Joining us now in New York, Rich Lowry, editor of National Review and a Fox News contributor. And here in Washington, Mo Elleithee, executive director of Georgetown University's Institute of Politics, a one-time Democratic spokesman, and now also a brand-new Fox News contributor. Welcome, gentlemen. Rich, you famously put out an issue of National Review against Trump, and you've been pretty steadfast in opposing him. Do you now have mixed feelings about Donald Trump becoming president?
Well, the against Trump issue was in the primaries, and in the general election we never got on board the Trump train, but our coverage of Hillary Clinton was much harsher. Every cover we ran about the presidential race in the general election was an anti-Hillary cover. I'm not sure any news organization out there had more harsh coverage and incisive coverage of the email controversy and the Comey investigation than we did. But yeah, I was surprised as anyone. I always wrote he could win this thing. I could see him getting to 260 electoral votes, but I had a lot of trouble seeing him getting over the top. He did it. My hat's off to him. And now we're hoping for the best.
You had a lot of company in that regard. Now, Trump, Rich, not only ran against the mainstream press, but he ran against you and National Review and the Weekly Standard and Bill Kristol and Krauthammer and Jonah. Does his victory undercut you a bit in terms of who now defines conservatism within the Republican Party?
Yeah, well, so in the party now we have this enormous populist wing that most people wouldn't have thought there was any chance that even existed a year ago. And the populists control the presidency within the party, the conservatives control Congress. And if everyone can keep it together, there's a chance to do a lot of good. But the populists clearly have the whip hand because you always want to control the White House. And if you look how just through the course of National Review's history, it's been more common that we've had uncomfortable and awkward relationships with Republican presidents rather than hand-in-glove relationships. Really the only exception would be Ronald Reagan, and we had problems with him at times. But when Trump is right and he's getting hit on all sides, we'll be among his fiercest defenders. When he's wrong, we'll have the independents to call him out and try to correct him.
All right. Mo, did liberal commentators like yourself underestimate Donald Trump and perhaps overestimate the appeal of Hillary Clinton?
Look, I think I also have been eating a lot of crow. I thought, you know, back in the spring during the primaries when we saw what was going on, I thought a lot of Democrats were underestimating his potential. I thought there was a path for him that he could win, but like Rich just said, and like a lot of other people, didn't think it was very likely. I think one of the problems that too many of us had was that we were too busy looking at this election through an old paradigm, looking at it through a paradigm of left versus right, looking at it through the paradigm of the two candidates, and didn't spend enough time looking at what was happening around the country and this populist wave that swept the country.
And I would say that the media, by and large, were guilty of that as well.
That's right.
Especially looking back. Now, but so when CNN's Van Jones says the election was a white lash against a black president, when Slate's Jamel Bouie says, I didn't realize how much white people hate us, is that adding to the divisiveness in the country?
Look, I believe that, again, and I was wrong before, but I believe that there was this incredibly strong, unheard voice in middle America that saw Donald Trump as the vehicle to be heard. It turns out that much of that voice was blue collar, was white. Now, what we need to be careful about is pitting that voice against the Democratic coalition, against African Americans and Hispanics. And where I think the left and Democrats are going to have to go moving forward is figuring out how to bridge these two different constituencies once again, as opposed to just taking one side against another.
Let me get Rich back in. When terms like white lash are thrown around, Barack Obama, remember, was not on the ballot this time. Do you think some in the media are going too far in defining this election in strictly and even harshly racial terms?
Of course, and it's what always happens. It's very boring, and it's completely wrong. As was pointed out earlier in the program, one of the key swing votes in this election was working-class voters who had voted for Obama in 2012 and went for Trump this time. They didn't all of a sudden become hideous racists in the course of 4 years. And I think it's very important for folks on the left to try to extend a little more sympathetic understanding to these working-class whites rather than having contempt for them. And Mo's exactly right. You know, you can appeal to both sides. And there used to be Democratic politicians who really tried to do that, like Bill Clinton. And it's just this time around, both the Democratic Party and the media just seem to think there was something wrong inherently in even trying to have appeal to these voters.
And Mo, I'm hearing some commentators on your side now talk about sexism, that Hillary Clinton couldn't get there, as opposed to all the other reasons we've talked about. She didn't visit Michigan until the very end, the emails, everything else, that she couldn't get there because she's a woman. Does that seem oversimplified or
I think it's
unfair
probably
to you?
a bit oversimplified. I'm not saying that there isn't inherent sexism in many ways, but I don't think that's what defined this election. What I will say, though, is whether we're talking about racism or sexism, I believe that we've got to try to bridge the gap, and we shouldn't overplay that. But having said that, it is important to realize that the rhetoric that Donald Trump used throughout the election did scare and alienate millions of Americans in a lot of these groups. And so there is still that voice that needs to be heard. I hope the president-elect, just as Democrats, I think, need to reach out and try to be heard by these white, blue-collar voters.
Right.
He has to begin to do his part to mend that divide with the people who are scared
Rich,
now.
I've got half a minute. I mean, Donald Trump ran against the press of all stripes, middle, left, and center. Do you think that was a factor in his victory?
It was. Republicans always complain about the press, and oftentimes it just comes off as whiny. I think it had more impact this time because the bias was more obvious, one, and two, it fit into this generalized theme that Trump had that was very powerful, that the system's rigged and our institutions are failing us. And the press is still, incredibly biased. If Trump supporters were out in the thousands after Hillary Clinton victory and breaking things and smashing windows and throwing things at cops, it would be front page news. There would be a tsunami of criticism throughout the media, and we're hearing none of that about these anti-Trump protesters.
I can't disagree with that. And on that point, Rich Lowry, Mo Elleithee, thanks very much for joining us.